This is Maggie. I am a designer from the Philadelphia area. In this project, we are going to work with JavaScript, and we are going to explore the Lodash.js library. Working through these steps in this project, we are going to implement new methods for numbers, strings, objects, and arrays. We are going to put our coding skills to the test. We come to the Lodash project and we can see that we have 42 steps that we will follow through. We are going to go from one method to the next, and we are going to work on 10 different methods from the Lodash library. As we move through our methods, we will start working with numbers, we'll move to strings, to objects, and methods for arrays. As we work with each method, we'll begin with the specify step. At this step, we will spend time just looking at what the method does. As you move through the steps, you'll find links to Lodash's page and charts and other examples. Then we will move to the ideate section. Here, there are steps for you to follow to get your thinking and logic in order to write the method. We encourage you to spend time here writing your method, and then moving to implement, where we will go through the steps of how to write the code and give hints. And then you'll end with testing your code to ensure that it's working as expected. As we move through these different methods, you'll find that there are different ways to approach writing the code. So don't get frustrated if the solution that we present is different than the solution that you come up with. Your solution is equally as valid as ours. You can write this whole project within the Codecademy environment or by downloading the Lodash folder here. I will be writing the project inside the Codecademy platform. We come to step 1 of our Lodash project. Here we're going to create our Lodash object. We are going to create a variable that is underscore. We type const underscore equals curly bracket semicolon. We have initialized our variable to an empty object. Step 1 is complete. We move on to step 2. Let's make sure that our Lodash object was initialized correctly. I'm going to begin by typing node space underscore .js. This will test the main file that we've created. I hit return. To run a file using node, we type the node command. Let's test our test files. So we are going to type the following: node space test lodash.js. As we move through our project, we will see that our test files are all located in the test directory. This test has printed a success message, so I am good to go. Step 2 is complete. We move on to step 3. We come to implement clamp. As we take a closer look at number 3, we can learn more about what this method of clamp does. We can follow the link out to Lodash's page, and we can read a summary of this method. What we are going to find is what this method will do is it will take an upper and a lower number, creating a range, and then this method will choose the number in between the lower and the upper. So when we take a look at how this is summarized, we know that it will take 3 arguments: a number, the lower bound, and the upper bound. This method will modify the number to be within the 2 provided bounds, the upper and the lower. If the provided number is smaller than the lower, it will return the lower as the final number. And if it is larger than the upper bound, it will return the upper bound as the final number. We can take a closer look at a diagram and see how this would actually play out. And once we have an understanding of what this function does, we move on to step 4. How are we going to write this piece of code? How are we going to implement this method? We can use the clamp method. We can use math max and math min. Let's take a closer look at step 5 and how we are going to implement this method. We begin by adding the method of clamp to underscore. We type clamp. We add our 3 parameters to this method: number, lower, upper. Then in between our curly brackets, we add the following code. We create a variable called lower clamped value. Here we type lower clamped value equals math.max, parentheses, number, lower. We are setting lower clamp value to equal the return value of math.max called with the number and lower. We create our second variable. We type clamped value equals math.min, parentheses, lower clamped value, upper. Then in step 5, we returned clamped value as our final value from the method. We type return clamped value. When we come back to ideate, we can see that by working with math.max and math.min, we have set the upper bound number and the lower bound number. We are going to return the number that is between these 2 bounds. Now we can test to see that this is working. We come to step 6 and we type the following: node test clamp.js. I wanted to show you this first test not working so you can get a sense of what it will look like. I see that it became red because it failed. So what I have to do is I'm going to come back, and in line 4 and line 5, I am going to change const to var. I only want to use the const keyword when it is a constant in the scope of this function. Once we make this change, we run our test again, and we see that it all passes. We come to step 7. Here, we're going to work with the method inRange. We will follow similar steps that we did for clamp. We begin with specify, and we take a look at what actually does this method do. In specify, we have a summary of this method, as well as a link out to the Lodash page where we can read more and see examples. When we summarize this method, we are going to find that this method will take 3 arguments: a number, a start value, and an end value. And it is going to check to see if a number provided falls within a specified range. So we have the start and the end values. We are checking to see if a number is between that range. When working with this method, it will return either true or false. So if the number is smaller than the start value, it will return false. If the provided number is larger than or equal to the end value, it will also return false. It will return true if it is in range. If there is no end value provided to the method, the start value will be 0, and the end value will be provided start value. As we come to the ideate section, we are forming our ideas. We are forming our mode of action. We note that we'll be using Boolean operators to find out if the number is in the specified range, the Boolean operators of true or false. We come to implement, and we begin to type our code. 1. Add a method to our underscore object called inRange. We type inRange. We add 3 parameters to this method: number, start, end. Within this method, we are going to create an if statement that checks to see if end is identified. We type if end equals undefined. Within our if statement block, we are going to set end equal to start, then set start equal to 0. We type end equals start, start equals 0. We move on to add another if statement, and this if statement should check whether start is bigger than end. We type if start is greater than end, Now, within the in statement block, we are going to swap two start and end values. We're going to create a variable called temp that is set to the current end value, then set end equal to start. Finally, we'll set start equal to temp. We type var temp equals end equals start, start equals temp. As we move on to part 7 of step 9, we are going to create a variable called isInRange, and we are going to set it equal to a Boolean expression that checks if start is smaller than or equal to number, and if number is smaller than end. So we type var InRange equals start less than equal to number ampersand ampersand number less than end. When we use the ampersand ampersand, it will return a Boolean value. It will be true if both operands are true and return false otherwise. Finally, we will return the value of isInRange from the method. We type return isInRange. Before I save and test this, I need to make sure that at line 7, that after the closing curly bracket for the method of clamp, that I add a comma. Then I can test my method. So I come to test to make sure InRange is working. I type node test inrange.js. I can see that my tests have all passed. I move on to step 11, to the method of words. This will be our first string method. Again, we can click the link and visit the Lodash page and find examples of how this is used. And we can also spend our time reviewing specifically how it will be used within our project. Here we have a summary of what this method should do. It will take one argument, which will be a string. It will split the string into an array of words. A word will be defined by space separated by string of characters. So what we're going to do is each space character will be opening and closing quotation, single quotation bracket with a space in between. The space in between will indicate the end of one word and the start of the next. We move on to ideate our plan, to gather our ideas and how we can go about approaching and writing this code. We are going to use a built-in JavaScript method to make this method as short and readable as possible. We begin by adding the words method to the Lodash object. Now we want to make sure that as we move from InRange to words that we have a comma. I type words. We are going to use the string split method to split the provided string on the space characters into an array of words. And we're going to implement our game plan in code. We began by adding words to our underscore object, and we're going to add one parameter to this method, which will be string. Within our brackets, within this block of code, we are going to create another variable called words. We type var words. We're going to set this variable equal to string split on space characters using the split method. We type var words equals string period split parentheses single opening and closing quotation mark. We make sure that we put a space in between the single quotation marks. Again, this space will be how our method will detect a new word. Then we are going to return words. Now we see if it is working. We type node test words.js. Now I see that I'm getting a red error message. When this happens, we want to go through the steps of fixing it. Words is defined, failed, was not properly defined. I changed var to const, S-C-O-N-S-T, and now it is working. It has passed all of its tests. I have completed through step 14, And now I move on to the pad method. Here we are going to find that we are going to add characters or truncate based on the specified length for a string. We come to step 15 and we can click out and read more on Lodash's page and see examples. And we also can take some time and read over and get an idea of what we will be doing when we write this method. We can take a look at the summary. Pad will take two arguments, a string and a length. Pad adds space evenly to both sides of the string to make it reach the desired length. Extra padding is added to the end of the string if an odd amount of padding is required to reach the specified length. As we move forward, we can take a look at the diagram provided and we move to ideate. Here, spend some time coming up with a plan how you're going to write this method, how you will put together this piece of JavaScript code. After you work on step 16, you can come to step 17 and follow along as I write this code. I come to step 17. As we prepare to type the method for pad, we make sure that after our last method, we end with a comma. As we implement, we begin by adding a method to our underscore object called pad. We will add two parameters to this method, string and length. We type pad, we add the parameters of string and length, and the curly brackets where we will place our code. Within the method, we are going to begin with an if statement. Our if statement will check if the length is shorter than or equal to string's length. If so, we will return string. We type if string.length is greater than or equal to length, return string. We also could have typed if length is less than or equal to string.length. We create a variable that is called start padding length. We set its value equal to the difference of length and string length divided by 2 and rounding it down by using math.floor. We type start padding length equals math.floor length minus string.length divided by 2. We create our variable called end padding length. We're going to set its value equal to length minus string length minus start padding length. We type end padding length equals length minus string.length minus start padding length. We're going to create a new variable called padded string and we'll set its value equal to the space character. Repeated start padding length number of times. We will use the string.repeat method, concatenated with string, concatenated with the space character, repeated end padding length number of times. We will write this as follows. Padded string equals space character, period, repeat, start padding length, plus string, plus space dot repeat, end padding length. Then we will return the value of padded string from the method. We save and we test our code. We type node test pad.js and it has passed. We move on to implement has. We want to make sure that where we finished with our pad method that we add our comma. And we begin with specify. We take some time to read over what the has method actually does. And in a nutshell, we're going to find that this one will return a Boolean, either true or false. And we are going to check if a path is a direct property of an object. So we take a look at our summary. We're going to see that our has method will take two arguments, an object and a key, and that it's going to check to see if the provided object contains a value at the specified key. If the object contains a value at the key, it will return true, and if not, it will return false. Step 19 is complete. We move on to step 20. Here we can spend some time and think about how we would go about writing this in JavaScript. You may want to pause here and work a bit and then come back to step 21, where I'm going to go through the steps of implementing our game plan in code. We begin. We add a method to our underscore object called has, and we add 2 parameters of object and key. We type has, we add the parameters of object and key, and we add our curly brackets where we will place our code. Within this method, we create a variable called hasValue and set its value equal to the result of checking to see if current value of object at key does not equal undefined. I'm going to begin by defining hasValue. I type const hasValue equals object, opening square bracket, key, closing square bracket. Now we are going to set its value equal to the result of checking to see if the current value of object at key does not equal undefined. We're going to use an if statement in order to write this. We type if hasValue is not undefined, return true. Our exclamation point here means not. For the else portion of this statement, then we will return false. So if it is undefined, it will return false. We move on to step 22 and we test our has method. We type node test has.js. The method that we have written has passed. Step 22 is complete. We move on to implement the invert method. We once again begin with specify, where we take some time and we read over what this method does. Again, we can visit the link to the Lodash page and read more about it and see examples of it being used. And we come back to Codecademy's platform and we read through specify. To summarize, the invert method will take one argument, an object. The invert method iterates through each key value pair in the provided object and swaps the key and value. We move on to ideate our game plan for how we're going to implement this functionality. We spend time reading through and writing and testing our code. And when we like what we have, we move from step 24 to step 25 and we implement our code. We add our comma and we hit return. We begin by adding a method to our underscore object called invert, and we're going to add 1 parameter to this method, object. We type invert, and again we add object as the parameter, and we have our opening and closing curly brackets where we will write the code for this method. Within this method, we begin by creating a variable called inverted object, and we set its value equal to an empty object. We type let inverted object equal opening closing curly brackets. This will specify an empty object. Now we're going to use a for in loop and iterate through each key in object. We type for, we have our opening and closing curly bracket. We'll type for let key in object. Within this loop, we want to create a variable called original value, and we're going to set it equal to the value at the current key in object. We type const original value equals object. Inside of our brackets, we type key, and we move on to, still within this loop, we're going to set the value at original value on inverted object to be the current key. We type inverted object equals, inside of our curly brackets, original value colon k. Finally, outside of our loop, we are going to return the value of the inverted object from the method. We type return inverted object. We save. I move to step 26 to test the method. I type node test invert.js. And I have passed my invert method test. We move on to the find key method. As we take a closer look at the find key method, again, we can follow to Lodash's page and we can read more about what this method will actually do. We see that it's actually similar to the find method, except it will return the key of the first element predicate. We can take a look at the arguments, at the returns, and it's always great to come and take a look at an example. So here we can see it being used to organize information. In particular, in this example, we are using this method to determine a person's age and if a person's age is less than 40. The find key method will return true or false. We come back to the Codecademy platform and we take a closer look at specify. And we have a summary of what we're going to do. We're going to use the find key method. We'll take two arguments, an object and a predicate function. And again, it will return a Boolean value of either being true or false. We will iterate through each key value pair in the provided object and call the predicate function with the value. We'll return the first key that has a value that returns a truthy value from the predicate function. Again, we can use this to go through data to determine if it is true or false, if the data meets our requirements or not. Find key will return undefined if no value from truthy values from the predicate function. As I take a closer look at task 28 and task 29, I can see how they both really work together. 29 gives me the plan of action, and 28 explains what I'm doing in each part of this method. So as I look at 28, it says add the find key method to the Lodash project. 29, add a method to our object called find key. Add two parameters to this method, object and predicate. We will name our predicate function parameter predicate since this is the name used in the Lodash documentation. I type find key and I set the parameters to object predicate. Now within the method, I'm going to use a for in loop to iterate through each key in object. What I am doing here is I am checking each key of the object. So I type the following: for let key in object. Now within this loop, I'm going to create a variable called value and set it equal to the value at the current key in object. I am finding the value of the object key. I type let value equal object k. Still working within this loop, we're going to create another variable called predicate return value, and we'll set it equal to the result of calling predicate with value. We are calling the predicate function on the value of object k. We type the following: let predicate return value equal predicate value. Finally, still working within this loop, we are going to use an if statement to check to see if predicate return value is truthy. If it is, return the current key from method. So we are checking to see if the function gives a truthy. We type if predicate return value, return key. Now we move outside of our loop and we return undefined to the address for all cases where no truthy values were returned from predicate. We type the following: undefined return undefined. We save and we test. We type node test find key.js. Our find key method has worked as expected. We have completed through task 30. We move on to implement drop. Now we're going to start implementing methods for our final data type, arrays. The first array method that we are going to use is drop. In specify, we can read through the explanation and examples of this method, and we can also visit Lodash's page. We see with drop, we are going to create a slice of array with n elements dropped from the beginning. We see our arguments, we see our returns, and we can come and see an example. As we take a closer look at our arguments, we see we have our array, which has the items, the array to query, and then we can see that we have the number of elements to drop from our array. And then with our return, we see we return the slice of array. As we take a close look at our example, we see our starting array and then our array after it runs through the drop method. We read through the summary of what our method should do. Our method will take 2 arguments, an array, and a number representing the number of items to drop from the beginning of the array. This method will return a new array which contains the elements from the original array, excluding the specified number of elements from the beginning of the array. And if the number of elements to drops is unspecified, our method should drop 1 element. We have an idea of what this method will do, and we move on to step 32 and step 33, realizing that these two really go closely together. Spend time reading through 32 to come up with your game plan. And as I move on to 33, I will reference the items in 32 as well. We take a look at implement and we see add a method to our underscore object called drop with 2 parameters, array and n. We type drop array n. We have our opening and closing curly bracket where we will write the code for this method. Within this method, we are going to use an if statement to check to see if n has been set. Within this if statement, we are going to set n equal to 1. As I take a closer look at ideate, I see that I am checking to see if number of items to drop was set. If not, set the number equal to 1. Using my if statement, I type. For this if statement, I'll type if n equals undefined, n equals 1. When we use our triple equal sign, we are doing a strict equality. This means that the values that we are comparing must have the same type. Outside of the if statement, we're going to create a new variable called dropped array and set its value to be a copy of the array, missing the first n elements by using the slice method. When we take a look at ideate, here we can see create a new copy of the original array with the specified numbers of elements dropped from the beginning of the array. Again, in ideate, it tells us to use the slice method to accomplish this. We type the following. Let dropped array equal array.slice n array.length. From here, we will return the dropped array. We type return dropped array. We save and we test the method that we have just written. Node test drop JS. The method that we have written has passed. We have completed steps 31, step 32, step 33, and step 34. Again, if you find that you get some error messages, don't worry about it. Go back into your code and keep working until you get what was expected. We move from drop to drop while. As we read through and review drop while, again, we can visit the Lodash page and take a closer look. This method will create a slice of array excluding elements dropped from the beginning. Elements will be dropped until predicate returns falsy. The predicate is invoked with 3 arguments, value, index, and array. As we take a look at our arguments, we see we have our array, which will be the array to query, and then we have our predicate and the function invoked per iteration. We can take a closer look at some of our examples, and we come back to Codecademy's platform and read through specify. The drop while method will take 2 arguments, an array and a predicate function. The supplied predicate function takes 3 arguments, the current element index, and the whole array. And drop while will create a new copy of the supplied array, dropping elements from the beginning of the array until an element causes the predicate function to return a falsy value. Again, this is another great method to organize data. We move on from taking an overview of what this method does to step 36 and step 37. We can spend some time in the ideate section reading over the different steps and what it is that we want to do before we move on to how we're going to implement it. Again, 36 and 37 line up very well together, the ideate and the implement. We begin by adding our drop while method to the Lodash object. We add our method to our underscore object called drop while, and we add two parameters to this method, array and predicate. I type drop while and add the two parameters of array and predicate. Within this method, I'm going to create a new variable called drop number and set its value equal to the return value of a call to find index on array. As I take a closer look in Ideate, I see that as I iterate through the array, that I will actually use find index to iterate through the array. Now, I can take a closer look at this method, and I know that this method returned the index of the first element in the array that satisfies the testing function. As I come back to the Codecademy platform, I type the following. Let drop number equal array.findIndex. Now I need to pass an anonymous callback function to findIndex that takes two arguments, element and index. This is the callback function. So I actually am going to just name it CB for callback, and I am going to define what this function does. So I type the callback function for CB, setting element and index as the two arguments. Within the callback function, I am going to return the negated return value of predicate called with element, index, and array. We're going to negate the value using the exclamation point, since we are looking to drop elements until the predicate returns a falsy value. However, findIndex is looking for the first truthy value, so we make every truthy value falsy and vice versa to get the value we are looking for. We type return exclamation point predicate element index array. We move on to after our drop number declaration, and we're going to create a new variable called dropped array. We're going to set its value to the return value of this drop function called with drop number. We are using this since the drop method is a method on the underscore object, which is the current object we are working with, and therefore the current value of this. We type let dropped array equal this period drop array drop number. Then we return our dropped array. We save and we test our method. We type node test drop while.js. Our function has passed and we are ready to move on to the next method. We begin by taking an overview and reading about the chunk method. This will be the last array method that we will implement, and we can take a look at the explanation. We can visit the Lodash page and we see that it will create an array of elements split into groups at a specific size. And if the array can't be split evenly, the chunk will be the remaining elements. So we take a look at our example and we can see here that we have our array and that we're going to create it and break it into groups of 2. So we see it broken into groups of 2. The next example, it's broken into groups of 3. This will return one chunk, and then we have the remaining one, the letter J. We see the look at the arguments. We'll take array and then a specified size, which would be the number, the length of each chunk. We can see again that this is another great way that we can organize information. We come back to Codecademy's platform and we take a look and read through the summary of what our method will do. It will take two arguments, an array and a size. It will break it up and supply the array into arrays of a specified size. It will return an array containing all the previously created array chunks in order of the original array. And if the array can be broken up evenly, the last chunk will be smaller than the specified size, just like we saw in the example. If no size is supplied to the method, the size is set to 1. We can take a closer look at the diagram that's provided. We see we have our function call of chunk. We're setting it to 3. And again, we see that it is broken into 2 groups of 3. We see our return value. We have our another example. Here we have a number of elements per chunk 4. and we see we have one example and that our second chunk contains remaining 2 elements. Here we have it set to using a default chunk size of 1, and each one is broken into 1. Now that we have an understanding of what this method does, we move on to ideate and to implement. We come up with our game plan for how we're going to work this method. We begin by adding the chunk method to the Lodash object. We add a method to our underscore object called chunk, and we're going to set 2 parameters to this method, array and size. We type chunk array size. I move into my method. I'm going to write an if statement that checks to see if size is undefined. Within the if statement block, I'm going to set the size equal to 0. After the if statement, I'll create a variable called array chunks and initialize it to an empty array. I actually am going to come up here and I'm going to set my size to 1 in my parameters. And then I'm going to move on and set array chunks to an empty array. I type let array chunks equal an empty array. I'm going to move on and I'm going to use a for loop that loops through array and has a counter that increments by size each turn of the loop. I type for let I equal 0, I is less than array dot length, I plus equals size. Within the for loop, I'm going to create a variable called array chunk, and I'm going to set it equal to the chunk of the array going from the current loop index to the current loop index plus size. I'm going to use the slice method to accomplish this. Again, I am working within the for loop. I type let array chunk equal array dot slice I, comma, I plus size. Still working within this for loop, we are going to add array chunk to the end of array chunks. And we're going to use a push method to accomplish this. We type array chunks dot push array chunk. Within our for loop, we added array chunk to the end of array chunks using the push method. We move outside of our array loop and we type return array chunks. We save. Now let's test and see if it works. We type node test chunk.js and we see that our method has passed. Congratulations, you've implemented all of the methods of this project. This is a huge accomplishment. Take a moment to congratulate yourself on how far you've come. You truly deserve it. As we move through this project, we spent time first reading about the method and understanding how it would be used. From there, we moved to ideate, where we spent time thinking about how we could go about writing this code, writing this method, and then we moved to implement, where we actually wrote the method. Then we tested it to see if it works, and when we got our error messages, we went back to our code base and worked on fixing it. From here, we encourage you to clean up your code by following Google JavaScript style guidelines, making sure that your code is easy to read and follow. This is Maggie from Codecademy. Happy coding!